We continue with the Colophons. Surah 33, Al-Ahzab, the clans, takes its name from the army of the allied clans which came against Yathrib, al-Medina, in the 5th year of the Hijrah, found in verse 9 through 25. Certain of the Bani Adir, a Jewish tribe, whom the Prophet had expelled from Yathrib on the ground of treason. And we see this in chapter 59, went first to the leaders of the Quraysh and Mecca, and then to the chiefs of the great desert tribe of Colophons, urging them to extirpate the Muslimin and promising them help from the Jewish population of Yathrib. As a result of their efforts, the Quraysh, with all their clans, and the Colophons, with all their clans, marched to destroy Yathrib. When the Prophet had news of their design, he ordered a trench to be dug before the city and himself led the work of digging it. The trench was finished when the clans arrived. 10,000 strong, the Prophet went out against them with his army of 3,000, the trench being between the two armies. For nearly a month, the Muslimin were exposed to showers of arrows in constant expectation of attack by much superior forces. And to make matters worse, news came that the Jewish tribe of Bani Qurayza in their rear had broken their alliance with the Muslimin and made common cause with Quraysh. The women and children had been put in strongholds, towers like the Peel Towers of northern England, of which every family of note had one for refuge in time of raids. These were practically unguarded, and some of the Muslimin asked permission of the Prophet to leave the battlefront and go to guard them, though they were not then in danger because of the Banu Qurayza were not likely to show their treachery until the victory of the clans was certain. The case of the Muslimin seemed, humanly speaking, hopeless, but a serious sympathizer, humanly speaking, as in from a material aspect, a secret sympathizer in the enemy camp managed to sow distrust between the Banu Qurayza and the chiefs of the clans, making both feel uneasy. The obstacle of the trench was unexpected and seemed formidable, and when a fierce, bitter wind from the sea blew for 3 days and nights so ferociously that they could not keep a shelter up, or light a fire, or boil a pot, Abu Sufyan, the leader of the Quraysh, raised the siege in disgust, and when Colophons one morning found Quraysh had gone, they too departed from their homes. On the very day when the Muslimin returned from the trench, began the siege of the traitorous Bani Qurayza and their towers of refuge. It lasted for 25 days, when they at length surrendered. Some of the tribe of Aus, whose adherents they were, asked the Prophet to show them the same grace that he had shown to the tribe of Khazraj in the case of Bani Nadir, in allowing them to intercede for their dependents. The Prophet said, "Would you like that one of you should decide concerning them?" They said yes, and he appointed Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, the great chief of Aus, who had been wounded and was cared for in the mosque. Sa'ad was sent for, and he ordered their men to be put to death, and their women and children to be made captives, and their property to be divided among the Muslimin at the Prophet's will. I have taken this account from the narrative of Ibn Khaldun, which is concise, rather than from that in Ibn Hisham, which is exceedingly diffuse. The two accounts, being in absolute agreement, verse 26 and 27 refer to the punishment of the Banu Qurayza. So these were the people who took, part that were, so dealt with. had nothing to do with their religion or whatever, and their survivors weren't forced to give up their synagogue or whatever people were saying. And verse 37, the reference is to the unhappy marriage of Zaid, the prophet's freed man and adopted son. Well, adopted into his guardianship, But in Islam, we don't call people who are you call people by their real fathers. Was Zainab the prophet's cousin, a proud lady of Quraysh? The prophet had arranged the marriage with the idea of breaking down the old barrier of pride and of caste, and had shown but little consideration for Zainab's feelings. Tradition says that both she and her brother were averse to the match, and that she had always wished to marry the prophet. For Zayd, the marriage was nothing but a cause of embarrassment and humiliation. When the prophet's attention was first called to their unhappiness, he urged Zayd to keep his wife and not to divorce her, being apprehensive of the talk that would arise if it became known that a marriage arranged by him had proved unhappy. At last, Zayd did actually divorce Zainab, and the prophet was commanded to marry her, in order by his example to disown the superstitious custom of the misassociating Arabs in such matters of treating their adopted sons as the real sons, which was against the laws of God, i.e., the laws of nature. Because how can you say there's natural law without a natural lawgiver? Whereas, in arranging a marriage, the woman's inclination ought to be considered. Unhappy marriage was no part of Allah's ordinance, and was not to be held sacred in Islam. Because in biblical Christianity, there's no divorce allowed. The surah contains further references to the wives of the Prophet, in connection with which it may be mentioned that from the age of 25 till the age of 50, he had only one wife, Khadija, 15 years his senior, to whom he was devoutly attached, and whose memory he cherished till his dying day, with the exception of Aisha, the daughter of his closest friend Abu Bakr, whom he married at her father's request when she was still a minor. All his later marriages were with widows whose state was pitiable for one reason or another. Some of them were widows of men killed in war. One was a captive when he made the marriage, the excuse of emancipating all the conquered tribes and restoring their property. 2 were daughters of his enemies, and his alliance with them was a cause of peace. It is noteworthy that the period of these marriages was also the period of his greatest activity, when he had little rest from campaigning and was always busy with the problems of a growing empire. The period of revelation is between the end of the 5th and the end of the 7th year of the Hijra. And one of the things in Islam is the command to pay very close attention to the whole, or getting divorced and that sort of thing, rather than being hasty about the decision. Give it some time and think over it 100 times. Think of it over 100 times, and give it a few months, and various things have been said. Sheba, Surah 34, takes its name from verse 15. Where Sheba, Saba, a region of Yaman, the south, because on the right hand, is mentioned as having been devastated by a flood. It warns of the effects of luxury. It's an early Meccan surah. And it's Sabah. So chapter 35 has itself a couple names. Al-Fatir, the creator, also called Al-Mala'ika, the light beings, the unfallen angels, takes its name from either case, from a word in verse 1, an early Meccan surah. Now, one of the things about that's extremely important to point out, that, because every chapter in the Quran is kind of paired, so Surah 35 and Surah 72, I say fallen angels, because these are beings that at some point made a decision. These are the male and female, the fallen angels are the male and female beings they're created of a fire that is not consumed like earthly fire, puts off a smoke and otherwise dwindles. We're not talking about, we got the clay, we got the fire, we got the light, in reference to the types of created beings. And of course, the matter, the ones that are incarnate in matter, the clay beings, were incarnate in matter. They have a different sort of, their spiritual side is not material, but their spiritual side is different than that of the other beings. So when I say unfallen angels, I don't mean that they're the same thing as the same type of thing as a jinn, and they're just the ones that made the good decision. They're a different type of creature that didn't have that. Surah 36. Yasin takes its name from the 2 letters of the Arabic alphabet which stand as the first verse and are generally held to signify Ya and San, O man. The surah is regarded with special reverence and is recited in times of adversity, illness, fasting, and on the approach of death. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan surahs. Surah 37. 36 is particularly good in the late afternoon. When someone's in their dying days, when there is some, what you would call psychiatric problem, thought, emotion particularly, sort of like a lullaby, it forces you to say it its way. The Quran speaks its way if you're careful with its recitation, but there are certain chapters that really, some that you can recite most of the Quran, in its way, but you really, start saying a particular musical way of saying it in certain chapters, and 36 is particular. And that way of saying for 36 is like 32 is kind of similar to 37, but As-Safat, those who set the ranks, takes its name from a word in the first verse, of 37. The reference in the first 3 verses is to the unfallen angels and is made clearer by verses 164 to 166, where the revealing angel speaks in person. Tradition says that the soothsayers and astrologers throughout the East were bewildered at the time of the prophet's coming by the appearance in the heavens of a comet and many meteors, which baffled all their science and made them afraid to sit at nights on high peaks to watch the stars, as was their general custom. They told inquirers that their familiars could no longer guide them, being themselves completely at a loss and terrified. This is the explanation usually given of verses 7 through 9, and of a passage of similar import in Surah 72, verses 8 through 10. It stands early in the middle group of Meccan surahs. So, serves as an exorcism, because those would take the jinn as their strongholds, as their guides. They got their, strength and what knowledge they had from authority themselves, and this worship of the jinn to kind of do things for the human being that they couldn't do for themselves. I mean, who's ever performed a goetic operation? And, there's other types of things too, but for example, who's ever performed a goetic operation and said, and when the whole thing was over, that they, that the spirit had made them wealthy, then, like, if something happens, it's like, well, the material world has done this, but maybe they've evoked themselves and gave themselves permission. So a person can evoke themselves to deal with their issues without actually worshiping these spirits. You can worship God and have the same effect, and if God's the provider, then God's going to do or not do things according to his will anyways. Surah 38, Sad. This surah takes its name from the letter of the Arabic alphabet, which stands alone in the first verse. Now, it's one of the 10 verses that has more than the separated letters, but there's 29 chapters. that start with these. One chapter, it's 2 verses, and the rest of them, which stands alone. Tradition says the first 10 verses were revealed when the leaders of the Quraysh tried to persuade Abu Talib to withdraw his protection from the Prophet, or when Abu Talib died. The former is the more probable. Its place is in the middle group of Meccan surahs, Meccan Suwar 39. Az-Zumar, the troops, takes its name from a peculiar word meaning troops or companies, which occurs in verse 71 and again in 73. Others take that verse 53 and 54 were revealed at Al-Madinah. It seems manifestly to belong to the middle group of Meccan Suwar, although Nodeka places it in his last group. Now, one of the things about that that's kind of interesting to consider is that, you think you're, I'm an individual and I'm a rebel. It's like, no, you're being pulled around along with the crowds too. If you're going to be of those of the right hand or those of the left hand, there's going to be groups of you. You're not going to be the only one, So these people who talk about the left-hand path and the right-hand path and all that stuff, it's usually, that's something different. The left-hand path being Tantra and the right-hand path being Yoga. I mean, those, that's basically, and using another Sanskrit word, Shariat, you can still be in that middle path. Al-Mu'min, the believer, takes his name from verse 28 and 45, which describes the attempt of a believer in the house of Pharaoh to dissuade his people from opposing Moses and Aaron. It is the first of 7 Suwar, beginning with the Arabic letters Ha-Mim, all of which are sometimes referred to as Ha-Mim. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan Suwar. Some authorities hold verse 56 and 57 to have been revealed at Al-Madinah. Now, when people Hamim means Qaf, Hamim, there's reasons in these chapters why you find some of the rituals that have been used with the opening verses and stuff. Mecca 56 and 57 reveal Al-Madinah. 41. Fusilat, they are expounded. Derives its name, the title, from a word in verse 2. It also often is called Ha-Mim Asajda, from a word in 37. Ha-Mim being added to distinguish it from Surah 32, which is called Asajda. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan Suwar, and the only prostration passage, in this group, 37, 38, there's 15 of those prostration passages, but there are 22 verses that encompass them. But Ashura, council, takes its name from a word in verse 38. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan Suwar. And one of the things about that that's important to point out is that the democracy that Islam calls for, the consultation that Islam calls for, is not some, whatever the populace says. There are certain rights that people, inalienable rights that people have, certain things that, I could go on, but Surah 43, as a proof, ornaments of gold, is the fourth of the Ha-Mim Suwar. It takes its name from a word meaning golden ornaments, which occurs in verse 35. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan Suwar, and it's not the only chapter that you could turn to and say, this gospel prosperity thing is not only nonsense, but wrong. Surah 44, a Dukhan, the smoke, takes its name from a word in verse 10. Tradition says that the smoke here refers prophetically to the haze of dust which surrounded Mecca At the time of the great drought and famine, which preceded the Muslim conquest of Mecca and facilitated it. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan Suwar. And (45) Al-Jathia, crouching, takes its name from a word in verse 28. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan Suwar. Kind of reminding you. Dukan, the smoke, takes its name from a word in verse 10. Tradition says that smoke here refers prophetically to the haze of dust which surrounded Mecca at the time of the great drought and famine, which preceded the Muslim conquest of Mecca and facilitated. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan surahs. Oh, I think I shared that. I wasn't exactly sure. So some of these, there's something I can edit out later if these are gone back to. But 45 reminds you, do what you can while you can. When you can stand and bow and prostrate and all that, try doing that. Because you don't want to be reminded you should and be made to do something. Don't mean to be all fire and brimstone and whatnot, but one of the things about the mentions of hell in Al-Quran is the interesting aspect of how it's not mentioned by itself. Other things, fire and brimstone and all that, but not only is it more graphic and that sort of things than what you'd expect, but not gratuitously and not gratuitously, and not, it's not like by itself. You're told the way out and whatever. Chapter 46, Al-Ahqaf, the wind-curved sandhills, a formation which will be familiar to all desert travelers, and which especially characterized the region in which the tribe of Ad were said to have originally lived. It takes its name from a word in verse 21 and is the last of the Ha-Mim group. It belongs to the middle group of Meccan Suwar, with the exception of verse 10, verse 15 through 18, verse 35, which were revealed at Al-Medina. And this chapter also relates to Surah 72 and the type of story related to particularly verse 29 to 32. That's how it explicitly relates, but Surah 47, Muhammad. The surah takes its name from the mention of the Prophet by name in verse 2, which is the third such in Quran. So if this was Muhammadianism, there's the Muhammadi and Sufi order, but if Islam was Muhammadianism, you think Muhammad would be mentioned more than 4 times by name. Jesus is mentioned 25. Muhammad's mentioned by Ahmed, but so 5. Jesus is mentioned 5 times as much. So most commentators agree that verse 18 was revealed when the Prophet, forced to flee from Mecca, looked back, weeping, for a last sight of his native city. Some have concluded the whole surah to be a Meccan revelation, but with no good reason. It belongs to the first and second years after the Hijrah, with exception of verse 18, which was revealed during the Hijrah. And see, that's one of the very, very important things that we should look at. Not only is verse 4 like to 8:12, and that, there's a context here. It's in the middle of a fight. And these believers, they're not fought because they're, the disbelievers aren't fought because they're disbelievers. They're fought because they've been persecuting and driving out of homes and killing and attacking. And see, it has nothing to do with whether they believe or not believe. Well, of course, them not believing has caused them towards these actions, but, so when this chapter is also called Al-Qital, the fighting, we look at that in its context. Surah 48, we'll have to go into next time because I don't. I think we can finish. Al-Fath, the victory, takes its name from the word fath, meaning victory, which occurs several times and refers not to the conquest of Mecca, but to the truce of al-Hudaybiyah, which, though at the time seemed a setback to the Muslimin, it proved, in fact, the greatest victory for al-Islam. In the 6th year of the Hijrah, the Prophet set out with some 1,400 Muslimin from al-Madinah and the country around, in the garb of pilgrims, not for war, but to visit the Kaaba, the cube at Mecca. When they drew near to Mecca, they were warned that the Quraysh had gathered their allies against them, and that their cavalry under Khalid ibn al-Walid was on the road before them. Making a detour through gullies of the hills, they escaped the cavalry, and coming into the valley of Mecca, encamped at al-Hudaybiyah below the city. The Prophet resolutely refused to give battle and persisted in attempts to parley with the Quraysh, who had sworn not to let him reach the Kaaba. The Muslimin were all the while in a position of some danger. Finally, Uthman ibn Affan was sent into the city as the man most likely to be well received on account of his relationships. Uthman was detained by the Meccans, and news that he had been murdered reached the Muslimin in their camp. It was then that the Prophet, sitting under a tree, think of verse 10 and 18 in connection with this, took from his comrades the oath that they would hold together and fight to the death, and it became known that the rumor of Uthman's death was false, and the Quraysh at length agreed to a truce, of which the terms were favorable to them. The Prophet and his multitude were to give up the project of visiting the sanctuary for the year, but were to make the pilgrimage the following year, when the misassociators undertook to evacuate Mecca for 3 days to allow them to do so. Fugitives from the Quraysh, the Muslimin, were to be returned, but not fugitives from the Muslimin to the Quraysh, and there was to be no hostility between the parties for 10 years, and there was never a victory, says Ibn Khaldun, greater than this victory, for as al-Zuhri says, when it was war, the people did not meet, but when the truce came and war laid down its burdens and people felt safe with one another, then they met and indulged in the conversation and discussion, and no man spoke of al-Islam to another, but the latter exposed it. So there entered al-Islam in those 2 years between al-Hudaybiyah and the breaking of the truce by the Quraysh as many as all those who had entered it but 4 or more. The date of revelation is the 6th year of the Hijrah, and one of the things, there's a lot of mystical connections to the last verse, it being the last verse 29, including everything you need to pronounce Arabic. Every letter, every vowel mark, it's got the Hamza. Last mention of Muhammad, the fourth by name, the very expounding nature of the literal and metaphoric implications of the verse.